We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Invisible Cracks. Drake Calloway never considered himself a vindictive man. After 23 years building Calloway Construction from the ground up, he'd weathered business rivals, economic downturns, and countless setbacks with the same stoic resilience that defined him since childhood. At 52, his salt and pepper hair and weather-beaten face told stories of a man who found salvation in hard work. Specifically, transforming abandoned buildings into architectural marvels across Chicago's evolving landscape. The November wind cut through his wool coat as Drake inspected the latest acquisition, the Harmon Theater, a once magnificent Art Deco building now standing derelict in the city's slowly gentrifying west side. His calloused fingers traced the crumbling facade as his mind calculated costs, timelines, and potential. This was his element. This was where he felt most alive. "Beautiful bones on this old girl," remarked Lyle Bradshaw, Drake's project manager and oldest friend. At 60, Lyle's massive frame had softened, but his insight remained razor-sharp. "Gonna cost a fortune to restore proper." Drake nodded, squinting up at the ornate cornice work. "Some things are worth saving, Lyle. Worth the investment." Lyle gave him a sideways glance. "Speaking of investments, how's Pamela feeling about the expansion? Still giving you grief?" Drake's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Pamela Calloway, his wife of 25 years, had once been his greatest supporter. The woman who believed in him when he was nothing but a contractor with big dreams and empty pockets. The woman who worked 2 jobs so he could get his business license. The woman who gave him Zoe, their brilliant daughter now finishing medical school. And the woman who, for the past 2 years, had become increasingly distant, critical, and disinterested in anything related to Drake or his work. "She's preoccupied with Zoe's wedding," Drake said finally. 7 months out, and it's all she talks about. "Big day," Lyle nodded. "Your little girl marrying a neurosurgeon. Not too shabby." Drake's phone buzzed. A text from Charlotte Ward, his executive assistant. "Emergency at Riverside Project. Inspector found major issues. Need you ASAP." Duty calls, Drake sighed, pocketing his phone. "Riverside's having problems. Want me to come?" Lyle asked. "No need. Stay here, finish the assessment. I'll handle Riverside." 2 hours later, Drake sat in his truck outside the Riverside Apartments, another renovation project nearing completion. The building inspector had found serious electrical issues, work that wasn't up to code and posed potential fire hazards. Work that had been overseen by Vince Thornhill, the project manager Drake had hired 6 months ago on recommendation from Westlake Development's owner, Maxwell Blackwood. Max and Drake had a complicated relationship, part friendly rivalry, part mutual respect, part intense competition. They often bid on the same properties, occasionally collaborated on major projects, and maintained a cordial relationship despite being Chicago's top 2 renovation specialists. "This is the 3rd issue with Thornhill's work," Charlotte said, scrolling through reports on her tablet. At 35, Charlotte was ruthlessly efficient, brilliant with numbers, and unwaveringly loyal to Drake. Some in the industry gossiped about their relationship, but the truth was simpler. Charlotte reminded Drake of himself 20 years ago, hungry, smart, and willing to work harder than anyone else. "Fire him," Drake said flatly, "and tell accounting to withhold his last check to cover these repairs." "Already drafted the termination letter," Charlotte nodded. "But Drake, there's something else. I've been reviewing the supply orders for the last 6 months." She hesitated. "Spit it out, Charlotte. The numbers don't add up. Materials ordered don't match what's being used on sites. And Thornhill's signature is on all the discrepancies." Drake rubbed his temples. "You think he's stealing from me? Or someone is? The extra materials are being delivered somewhere, and it's costing us nearly $50,000 so far." Drake's phone rang. Pamela. He declined the call, something he found himself doing with increasing frequency lately. "Dig deeper," he told Charlotte. "If someone's stealing from me, I want to know who, why, and how much. And I want it quiet for now." Drake returned home late that evening to find the sprawling lakefront house dark except for the soft glow emanating from his home office. He paused in the doorway, watching Pamela rifling through his desk drawers. "Looking for something?" he asked. Pamela startled, nearly dropping the file in her hand. At 50, she remained striking. Her blonde hair expensively maintained, her figure kept slim through rigorous workout routines and strict diets. Her wardrobe consistently refreshed with designer labels. "Drake, God, you scared me." She smoothed her silk blouse. "I was looking for the contact information for that florist you used for the Hilton renovation. The one who did those amazing arrangements." Drake leaned against the doorframe. "At 11:30 at night? In my personal files? Zoe's wedding, Drake. I'm meeting vendors tomorrow." She sighed dramatically. "You'd know this if you ever bothered to be involved." "I'm paying for it, Pamela. That's my involvement." He stepped into the room. "What's that file you're holding?" She glanced down as if surprised to find it in her hand. "Just some old tax documents. I got distracted looking through things." Drake took the file, financial statements from their joint accounts. "Anything interesting?" "Not particularly." She brushed past him, her perfume lingering. Clive Christian #1. The bottle he'd given her for their anniversary 3 months ago that she claimed not to like. "I'm exhausted," she announced. "Don't stay up too late. We have brunch with the Kellers tomorrow." After she left, Drake carefully examined his office. Other drawers had been opened, papers slightly displaced. His computer showed recent activity. Someone had tried to access it but been stopped by the password. He checked his watch, nearly midnight. He opened his laptop and clicked through to the security system. The house cameras showed Pamela leaving at 9:15 a.m. that morning, returning at 4:37 p.m. with shopping bags, then leaving again at 7:22 p.m., returning at 10:58 p.m. 5 hours unaccounted for during the day, and over 3 hours tonight. Both times dressed more formally than her usual daytime attire. Drake closed the laptop, a cold weight settling in his stomach. He'd suspected for months, but had pushed the thoughts away, buried himself in work, blamed her distance on Zoe's upcoming wedding. But now, he opened his phone and found the contact information for Miriam Sloan, a private investigator who had helped with background checks on potential employees. He composed a brief email requesting a meeting tomorrow, then took one last look at the financial statements Pamela had been examining. His personal accounts, not their joint accounts. Accounts she had no legitimate reason to be interested in. Something was very wrong in his marriage. And Drake Calloway was a man who preferred to face problems head-on. Chapter 2. Paper Trails. Drake met Miriam Sloan at a small diner well away from his usual haunts. The investigator was unassuming, a 50-something woman with practical clothes and observant eyes that missed nothing. "Surveillance on your wife will run you between $500 and $800 a day, depending on how complicated it gets," Miriam explained, sipping black coffee. "I'll need a retainer of $5,000 to start." Drake slid an envelope across the table. $10,000. "I want her followed whenever she leaves the house. I want to know who she meets, where she goes, what she does. I want photographs. And I want her electronic communications." Miriam raised an eyebrow. "That's more complicated. Legally questionable." "I own the phones, the accounts, and the computers," Drake said flatly. "My company, my equipment. Still potential privacy issues." Miriam studied him. "You sure you want to go down this road? Once you know things, you can't unknow them." Drake thought about Pamela's increasingly frequent absences, her disinterest in their life together, the way she scrutinized his business finances, the way she hadn't initiated intimacy in over a year. "I'm sure." 3 days later, Drake sat in Miriam's sparse office reviewing photos. Pamela entering the Grand Wellington Hotel. Pamela having lunch at Moretti's with 3 women Drake didn't recognize. Pamela shopping at exclusive boutiques on Oak Street. And then, Pamela meeting Maxwell Blackwood at a secluded restaurant in Evanston. "This could be innocent," Miriam cautioned. "Business lunch." "She doesn't have business with Max Blackwood," Drake said grimly. More photos. Pamela and Max walking close together in Lincoln Park. Pamela and Max entering his downtown penthouse apartment. Pamela leaving the same apartment 3 hours later, her hair slightly disheveled. "There's more," Miriam said, pulling out a file. "Your wife has opened separate bank accounts." She's been transferring money from your joint accounts, small amounts, nothing that would trigger immediate notice. About $200,000 over the past 8 months. Drake's face remained impassive, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the arms of his chair. What about communications? Text messages between them going back 14 months, Miriam said, sliding over printouts. Started professional, got personal, then intimate. They use a separate messaging app for the explicit communications. The content suggests the physical relationship began about 10 months ago. Drake flipped through the texts, each one a fresh betrayal. Max, miss you already. Can't wait until Thursday. Pamela, D working late again. Could come by tonight instead. Max, perfect. Bring the blue dress. And nothing underneath. There's one more thing, Miriam said carefully. They discuss you. Drake braced himself and continued reading. Pamela, he suspects nothing. Too obsessed with his buildings to notice what's happening right under his nose. Max, how much longer until we can stop sneaking around? Pamela, after Zoe's wedding. Everything changes then. I've got a plan in motion. Max, the old man won't know what hit him. You're brilliant, babe. Cold rage settled over Drake, crystallizing his thoughts. Is there anything about business information? Financials? Project details? Miriam hesitated. Yes. She's been photographing your contracts, financial statements, client lists, sending them to Blackwood. Industrial espionage. His wife wasn't just sleeping with his rival. She was sabotaging him professionally. The Thornhill connection? Drake asked, already suspecting the answer. Recommended to you by Blackwood specifically. He's been feeding information to Blackwood and helping with the materials theft. Drake stood abruptly. Keep watching. I want to know everything. And Miriam? Not a word to anyone. Back in his office, Drake pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Names, dates, accounts, properties. A timeline of betrayal. His marriage had been a sham for at least a year. His business was being targeted. And somehow, it all connected to Zoe's upcoming wedding. The conversation he'd overheard between Pamela and her mother Vivian Keller last week suddenly made more sense. Just wait until the wedding, mother. Drake will finally get exactly what he deserves, and no one will blame me for what happens next. He'd assumed she meant divorce. Now he realized the plan was far more sinister. Drake picked up the phone and dialed Lyle's number. I need you to quietly transfer half our liquid assets to new accounts, he instructed without preamble. New bank entirely. And I need full background checks on every employee connected to Thornhill or hired in the last year. Drake, what's going on? Lyle's concern was evident. I'm being played, old friend, but not for much longer. Next, he called his lawyer, Stanley Goldman. Stan, I need everything prepared for an immediate divorce filing. And I need you to connect me with the best forensic accountant in Chicago. This stays between us. That night, Drake sat alone in his home office, reviewing 25 years of marriage. The early struggles, the birth of Zoe, building the business together until Pamela lost interest and focused on their social standing instead. The gradual coldness that had crept between them like frost on glass. Had she ever loved him? Or had he simply been a vehicle for her ambitions, discarded once she found a better option? His phone buzzed with a text from Miriam. Meeting happening now between Subject P, Subject M, an unknown third party at Lakeside Terrace Restaurant. Getting photos. An hour later, the photos arrived. Pamela, Max, and Vince Thornhill heads together in intense conversation. The pieces were falling into place, and Drake Calloway began plotting a revenge as methodical and precisely engineered as his finest buildings. Chapter 3. Blueprints of Vengeance. Drake established a secure office in a small property he owned off the books, a converted loft above an old mechanic's garage that he'd purchased during the recession and never developed. Here, he could work without fear of Pamela's prying eyes or corporate spies. On the exposed brick wall, Drake created what Lyle called his conspiracy board, photos, documents, and notes connected by colored strings. Red for Pamela's betrayal, blue for Max Blackwood's business interference, green for the financial trails, yellow for Zoe's wedding connections. This is some serial killer level organization, Charlotte remarked during one of their planning sessions. Drake had brought only his most trusted confidants into his confidence: Charlotte, Lyle, and his old friend Garrett Nash, a former FBI forensic accountant who now worked exclusively for Drake. If we're going to dismantle this operation, we need to understand every angle, Drake replied, pinning up a new document, proof that materials from his sites were being diverted to Blackwood's projects. Garrett whistled low. They've been systematically bleeding you dry, man. Between the materials theft, the contract interference, and your wife's financial maneuvers, they've cost you nearly $3 million in the past year. 4 projects lost to Blackwood after confidential bid information was leaked, Charlotte added, checking her tablet. And your wife has been quietly liquidating assets you didn't even know she had access to. Drake turned to them. What's the connection to Zoe's wedding? Why is that date significant? Lyle cleared his throat. I might have something on that. Zoe's fiancé, Dr. Benjamin Porter? His father is Judge William Porter. Who handles primarily, Drake prompted, commercial litigation and financial crimes in Cook County, Lyle finished, including the lawsuit against Marsden Development last year for fraud and contract interference. Drake remembered the case. Another developer taken down by suspicious circumstances, with Blackwood acquiring the assets at a fraction of their value after the judgment. They're setting me up, Drake said slowly. They're planning to manufacture evidence of financial crimes, use Pamela's mother's connections to get it before Judge Porter, and then Blackwood swoops in to pick up the pieces of your company while you're fighting criminal charges, Charlotte finished. And your wife walks away with a divorce settlement before the assets are frozen, protected by claiming she knew nothing about your crimes. The wedding is the perfect cover, Garrett added. Everyone focused on the celebration, emotions running high, guard down. Plus, with Porter becoming family, any claims you make about conspiracy would look like desperate attempts to smear your new in-laws. Drake stood silently, staring at the board. 25 years of building something from nothing, and his wife planned to help destroy it all. We have 3 months until the wedding, he said finally. So we have 3 months to reverse this trap. Over the next weeks, Drake operated on 2 fronts. Publicly, he continued as normal, running his business, attending planning meetings for Zoe's wedding, playing the oblivious husband. He even increased his working hours to give Pamela more freedom, making it easier for Miriam to document her activities. Privately, he executed his counter-strategy. First, he secured his assets. With Garrett's help, he created a labyrinth of legal protections around his core holdings, transferring ownership to trusts, restructuring the business hierarchy, and documenting every questionable transaction initiated by Pamela or Thornhill. Second, he gathered evidence. Miriam provided an ever-growing file of Pamela's activities with Blackwood. Drake installed specialized accounting software that tracked and flagged every financial anomaly. Charlotte interviewed employees connected to Thornhill, building cases against those involved in the theft. Third, he researched Blackwood's operation. Through discreet inquiries and carefully cultivated sources, Drake built a comprehensive picture of Blackwood's business, including evidence of tax fraud, permit violations, and labor law infractions. And fourth, most painfully, Drake approached his daughter Zoe for a private lunch away from either Pamela or Ben Porter. Zoe arrived at the small Italian restaurant, looking harried. At 28, she was the perfect blend of her parents' best features: Drake's determined jawline and analytical mind, Pamela's elegant features and social grace. "Dad, I only have an hour before rounds," she said, kissing his cheek before sitting. Mom's freaking out about the wedding seating arrangements, and Ben's parents are pushing for more of their friends to be included. Drake studied his daughter's face. "Are you happy, Zoe? With Ben, with the wedding plans, with all of it?" She looked surprised. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be? Just making sure this is what you want, not what everyone else wants for you." Zoe softened. "Ben's a good man, Dad. Smart, kind, ambitious in the right ways." She paused. "He reminds me of you, actually. That same quiet determination." Drake nodded, relieved. At least his daughter's relationship seemed genuine. "There's something else I need to discuss," he said carefully. "It's about the wedding, about your mother." Zoe tensed. "Dad, if this is about you two fighting again." "It's not that. Drake took a deep breath. Has your mother suggested anything unusual about the seating arrangements? About where I'll be sitting during the reception? Zoe frowned. She mentioned you might need to leave early because of work. And something about your table being near the kitchen because you want to check on the service. She tilted her head. What? Drake chose his words carefully. I have reason to believe your mother is planning something inappropriate for the wedding. Something that might disrupt your day. Like what? Zoe looked skeptical. I'm still figuring that out. But I'm asking you to trust me. If anything unusual happens with the arrangements, anything that seems designed to separate me or embarrass me, will you let me know? Zoe studied him, her doctor's eyes clinically assessing. This is serious, isn't it? Not just you two bickering. It's serious, Drake confirmed. But I don't want you involved beyond this conversation. Your focus should be on your wedding and your career. Mom said you've been distant, obsessed with work, that you're having some kind of midlife crisis. Drake smiled sadly. I've been preoccupied, yes, but not with what she thinks. As they parted outside the restaurant, Zoe hugged him tightly. I love you, Dad. Whatever's happening between you and Mom, please try to fix it before the wedding. For me, I love you too, sweetheart. And I promise, by your wedding day, everything will be resolved one way or another. 2 days later, Zoe called him. Dad, something weird just happened. Mom insisted that instead of place cards, they're going to have custom name tags for everyone at the reception. Says it's the new trend. Name tags, Drake repeated, at a formal wedding reception. I know, right? But here's the weird part. When I asked to see the proof for yours, she changed the subject completely. And later, I overheard her on the phone with Grandma Vivian, laughing about some joke they're planning. Thank you for telling me, Zoe. Dad, what's really going on? Drake sighed. I hope to have answers for you soon. Just focus on your happiness now. After hanging up, Drake added a yellow string to his board, connecting Pamela to a new note, name tag plan. The final piece arrived a week later, when Miriam sent an encrypted file containing an audio recording from a meeting between Pamela, Vivian, and Max in Vivian's Lake Forest mansion. The name tag will say housekeeper, Pamela's voice, gleeful and cruel. Mother will make sure he's seated at the staff table. Max and I will be at the main table with Zoe and Ben. What if he makes a scene? Max's voice concerned. He won't, Vivian replied confidently. Drake's too proud, too concerned with appearances. And once Judge Porter makes the announcement about the special award from Max's company, the focus will shift completely away from him. And the next morning, Pamela continued. While he's nursing his wounded pride, the SEC shows up at his office with the evidence we've manufactured. Evidence you manufactured, Max corrected. Keep me out of that part. Please, Pamela scoffed. Your hands are as dirty as mine. Those falsified contracts have your signature all over them. Drake listened to the entire hour-long recording, his face impassive. When it finished, he turned to his team. Now we know the plan. They intend to humiliate me at the wedding, then destroy me professionally the next day. He stood, rolling up his sleeves. So we accelerate our timeline. Charlotte, Lyle, execute phase 1 tomorrow. Garrett, finalize the financial documentation. And someone give me Judge Porter's complete career history and case record. What are you going to do? Lyle asked. Drake checked his watch. I have a tuxedo fitting with my future son-in-law. Time to get to know the Porter family a little better. As he left, Garrett called after him. Drake? How far are you willing to go with this? Drake turned in the doorway, his expression cold. They didn't just betray me, Garrett. They're willing to hurt my daughter, turn her wedding into a weapon. There are no limits anymore. Chapter 4, Shadowboxing. Benjamin Porter proved unexpectedly likable. Drake had approached the tuxedo fitting prepared to dislike his future son-in-law on principle. But Ben's genuine enthusiasm about marrying Zoe and his respectful but not obsequious attitude toward Drake slowly chipped away at his resistance. Sir, I know we haven't had much time together. What with my residency hours and your work schedule, Ben said as they waited for alterations. But want you to know how much I admire what you've built. The way Zoe talks about you. It's clear you're her hero. Drake studied the young doctor, 32, already specializing in pediatric neurosurgery, with an earnest face and direct manner. And your father? The judge? What kind of relationship do you have with him? Ben's expression flickered briefly. Complicated. He had very specific expectations. Law school, like him. When I chose medicine instead. He shrugged. We're better now. But there was a time when we barely spoke. And your mother? Passed away when I was 15. Cancer. Ben adjusted his cuffs. Dad never remarried. Buried himself in his work instead. Drake nodded, filing away this information. I understand your father will be presiding over the Hightower case next month. Significant matter. Ben looked surprised. You follow legal cases? I follow anything that might impact Chicago's development landscape, Drake replied smoothly. Your father has a reputation for being tough on financial crimes. He believes in accountability, Ben said, a note of pride in his voice. Says the system only works when powerful people face the same consequences as everyone else. Admirable philosophy, Drake murmured, forming the beginnings of a new strategy. After the fitting, Drake made a detour to the courthouse, slipping into the back of Judge Porter's courtroom during public proceedings. William Porter was exactly as Drake had imagined, austere, meticulous, with penetrating eyes that seemed to dissect each attorney's arguments. The proceedings concerned a real estate fraud case, and Porter's questioning revealed a sharp mind with little patience for obfuscation. Mr. Yanowitz, Porter addressed the defense attorney. Your client's explanation requires this court to believe in an extraordinary series of coincidences and misunderstandings. While not impossible, such a narrative strains credulity. Perhaps you might advise your client that this court values forthrightness above creative storytelling. Drake smiled slightly. Judge Porter might be exactly the ally he needed if approached correctly. That evening, as Pamela attended yet another wedding planning meeting, actually a rendezvous with Blackwood, according to Miriam's surveillance, Drake executed the first phase of his counterattack. Charlotte and Lyle coordinated simultaneous terminations of 11 employees connected to Thornhill's operation, including 2 senior project managers who had been feeding information to Blackwood. Each employee was presented with evidence of their complicity in the material's theft or information leaks, along with a choice. Sign a detailed confession in exchange for no criminal charges or face prosecution. By midnight, Drake had 9 signed confessions. The remaining 2 are lawyering up, Charlotte reported by phone. Donato and Pearson, the ones closest to Thornhill. Let them, Drake replied. We have enough to proceed. What about the warehouse? Secured. Inventory matches exactly what was reported stolen. Everything photographed and documented with chain of custody procedures, as you requested. Drake nodded, though Charlotte couldn't see him. And Thornhill? Gone. Cleaned out his apartment this afternoon. Phone disconnected. He's running to Blackwood. Expected. Drake checked his watch. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. Be ready. The next morning, Drake visited his attorney, Stanley Goldman's office with Garrett in tow. We have everything we need, Drake told the silver-haired lawyer, sliding a thick folder across the desk. Complete documentation of systematic theft, industrial espionage, and conspiracy involving Maxwell Blackwood, Vincent Thornhill, and multiple former employees of my company. Stanley reviewed the documents, frowning. This is extremely serious, Drake. Criminal charges, civil liability, millions in damages. I'm aware. And your wife's involvement? Drake's jaw tightened. Documented separately. That's a personal matter I'll handle differently. Stanley nodded, knowing better than to press. What do you want to do with this information? 2 things, Drake said. First, prepare a complete case file for the district attorney's office, but don't file yet. We hold that in reserve. And second, schedule a meeting with Judge William Porter. Unofficial. Off the record. Stanley's eyebrows shot up. The same Judge Porter who's about to become your in-law? Drake, that's extremely unorthodox. Potentially inappropriate. Not to discuss any cases, Drake clarified. A personal matter regarding the wedding. My future son-in-law's father should be made aware of certain security concerns. Stanley looked skeptical but nodded. I'll see what I can arrange. Discreetly. 2 days later, Drake sat in Judge Porter's private chambers, the 2 men alone at the judge's small conference table. Mr. Calloway, my clerk indicated this meeting concerned security issues related to Benjamin and Zoe's wedding, Porter began formally. While I agreed to this unusual meeting out of concern for the event, I must emphasize that my judicial position precludes certain discussions. I understand completely, Your Honor, Drake replied, and I appreciate your caution. What I'm about to share with you has nothing to do with any cases before your court, but everything to do with our children's wedding. Drake carefully laid out selected evidence of Pamela's affair with Blackwood, the planned humiliation at the wedding, and the scheme to announce Blackwood's Achievement Award at the reception, all without mentioning the financial crimes or the SEC investigation they planned to trigger. Porter's expression remained judicial, impassive, evaluating, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his pen. You understand what you're alleging, Mr. Calloway? That my son is being manipulated as part of some vendetta against you. Not Benjamin, Drake clarified. He's an innocent party, like my daughter. But yes, their wedding is being co-opted. And because I care deeply about Zoe's happiness, I've refrained from exposing this situation publicly. These recordings, Porter gestured to the evidence file, legally obtained. Every piece of evidence was collected by licensed professionals using legal methods, Drake assured him, the careful phrasing not lost on the judge. Porter was silent for a long moment. What exactly are you asking of me, Mr. Calloway? Nothing that compromises your position, Your Honor. Simply awareness, and perhaps your discreet assistance in ensuring that the wedding remains focused on Benjamin and Zoe, rather than becoming a platform for others' agendas. You're not asking me to intervene in any legal matters that might arise from this situation? Absolutely not, Drake said firmly. Any legal issues will proceed through proper channels, without any expectation of your involvement. Porter studied Drake intently. You know, Benjamin speaks very highly of you. Says you remind him of me, methodical, principled. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though perhaps less rigid. High praise, Drake acknowledged. I've come to respect your son greatly in our limited interactions. He deserves better than to have his wedding day tainted by these machinations. Porter stood, signaling the end of the meeting. I appreciate your discretion in this matter, Mr. Calloway, and your concern for our children's happiness. He extended his hand. Rest assured, I take family matters very seriously. As they shook hands, Porter added quietly, and I despise having my court used as a pawn in anyone's personal games. Drake left the courthouse knowing he'd found a powerful ally. The judge wouldn't interfere directly, but he was now alert to the possibility of his court being manipulated, and Drake suspected William Porter would begin scrutinizing any Blackwood-related matters with heightened attention. Meanwhile, Charlotte implemented Phase 2 of the plan, financial isolation. Working with Garrett, she systematically secured every aspect of Drake's business against Pamela or Blackwood's interference. Access credentials were changed, banking authorizations updated, new security protocols implemented across all projects. Simultaneously, Lyle coordinated with trusted site managers to increase physical security at all project locations, installing additional cameras and implementing strict materials tracking. We've essentially created a financial and operational fortress, Charlotte reported at their next secret meeting. Nothing gets in or out without multiple authorizations. How's Pamela reacting? Lyle asked. Drake pulled up Miriam's latest surveillance summary on his tablet. Frustrated, she tried to access our joint investment account yesterday and found the balance significantly reduced. Did you move the money? Charlotte looked concerned. No, I documented her withdrawals over the last 6 months and filed a formal fraud report with the investment firm. They've frozen the account pending investigation. Garrett whistled. Cold, man. Very cold. She's stealing from me to finance her affair and my destruction, Drake said flatly. I'm simply creating a paper trail. The next day, Pamela confronted him in his home office, her carefully maintained composure cracking. The Merrill Lynch account is frozen, she said without preamble. Something about suspicious activity. Drake looked up from his laptop with practiced confusion. Really? That's concerning. Did you call them? Of course I called them. Her voice rose slightly. They said you filed some kind of fraud report. I did, Drake confirmed calmly. Their security department flagged unusual withdrawals. Large amounts to accounts I didn't recognize. They asked if I had authorized them. I hadn't. Pamela's face flushed. Those were for Zoe's wedding expenses. Interesting, Drake said, opening a folder on his desk. Because none of the withdrawals match any wedding vendor payments. I've been keeping careful records, Pamela. The deposits went to a private account at Chicago Trust. Your account. For a moment, Pamela seemed genuinely rattled, but quickly recovered. I consolidated the wedding funds for easier tracking. You've been so busy, I didn't want to bother you with details. Drake just looked at her, saying nothing. Don't you trust me? She demanded. Should I? He countered quietly. Something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear, before her expression hardened again. This is ridiculous. I'm trying to give our daughter the wedding she deserves while you're buried in work, and now you're accusing me of... What exactly? Drake closed the folder. I've accused you of nothing, Pamela. I simply reported unauthorized transfers to our financial institution. If everything is legitimate, as you claim, I'm sure it will be resolved quickly. She stared at him, clearly trying to determine how much he knew. Fine. Use your own money for the rehearsal dinner, then. I've already told Vivian you'd handle it personally. After she stormed out, Drake sent a text to Miriam. Subject agitated. Expect emergency meeting with associates. Sure enough, Miriam's report that evening confirmed a hasty gathering at Blackwood's penthouse involving Pamela, Max, and Vivian Keller. He knows something, Pamela's voice on the recording, tense and angry. The financial flagging, the employee terminations, the increased security at the job sites. Calm down, Max's voice, attempting to sound confident, but with an undercurrent of concern. He's suspicious, but he doesn't have proof. If he did, we'd already be facing consequences. The plan moves forward, Vivian declared firmly. We accelerate if necessary. I've already spoken with the wedding planner about the seating arrangements and name tags. Everything is in place for the reception. What about the SEC documentation? Pamela asked. Ready to file? Max assured her. The moment the wedding is over, everything is in motion. By Monday morning, Drake Calloway will be fighting criminal charges while we dismantle his company. And you're sure Porter will get the case? Pamela pressed. The chief judge owes me, Vivian said smugly. William Porter will preside. And once he sees the evidence, Drake stopped the recording, turning to his team. They're moving forward, but they're nervous. Time for phase 3. The wedding is in 3 weeks, Charlotte reminded him. We're cutting it close. Good, Drake said grimly. Let them think they're winning until the very end. Phase 3 began with a series of strategic legal maneuvers. First, Drake established a revocable trust to protect Zoe's inheritance, ensuring that regardless of what happened to him or his company, her financial future was secure. Second, through Stanley Goldman, he quietly filed sealed documentation with the court outlining Blackwood's history of fraudulent business practices, creating a record that would be available to any judge assigned to cases involving Blackwood's companies. Third, he prepared comprehensive divorce papers documenting Pamela's infidelity, financial misconduct, and conspiracy, ready to serve at the perfect moment. But the masterstroke involved a more personal touch. Drake arranged a private meeting with Maxwell Blackwood, ostensibly to discuss collaborating on a major downtown redevelopment project. They met at Blackwood's office, a sleek, ultramodern space with dramatic views of the Chicago skyline. Blackwood greeted Drake with practiced cordiality, though wariness lurked behind his smile. Drake, this is unexpected, but welcome. Your assistant was quite mysterious about the purpose of this meeting. Drake studied his rival, 60, silver-haired, expensively tailored, with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to getting his way. I'll be direct, Max. The Richardson Block redevelopment. City's looking for proposals next month. $20 million in tax incentives, prime location. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. We're both bidding on that, I assume. I'm proposing a joint venture instead, Drake said smoothly. Your design aesthetic, my restoration expertise. Split the financial exposure, share the profits. City loves collaboration. We be favored. Blackwood looked genuinely intrigued despite himself. Interesting proposition. Why now? We've been competitors for years. Drake leaned back. Markets getting tougher. Costs rising. Smart play is consolidation of resources. And this sudden spirit of cooperation has nothing to do with your personal situations? Blackwood probed carefully. Drake allowed a carefully calculated flash of confusion to cross his face. Personal situations? Blackwood studied him intently. Just business pressures, then? What else would it be? Drake countered. The meeting continued with Drake laying out a compelling business case for collaboration, one that would genuinely benefit both companies if implemented. He left Blackwood with detailed projections and a proposed organizational structure. I'll need your answer within a week, Drake said as he prepared to leave. City's deadline won't wait. I'll review the numbers, Blackwood promised, walking him to the elevator. It's an intriguing proposition. As the elevator doors were closing, Drake added casually, "Oh, and Max? Looking forward to seeing you at Zoe's wedding. Pamela mentioned you've been added to the guest list." The momentary flash of panic in Blackwood's eyes was exactly what Drake had been waiting for. Confirmation that Blackwood now faced a dilemma. If Drake truly didn't know about the affair and conspiracy, then Blackwood was being offered a legitimate and profitable business opportunity. If Drake did know and was playing some kind of game, rejecting the offer might accelerate whatever countermeasures Drake had planned. Back in his secret office, Drake updated his team. Blackwood's rattled. He can't figure out if I know and I'm toying with him, or if I'm genuinely oblivious. What do you think he'll do? Lyle asked. He'll string along the business proposal while they accelerate their original plan. They can't risk waiting until after the wedding now. Drake pinned a new note to his board, which means we need to be ready for their move whenever it comes. 3 days later, it came. Pamela announced over breakfast that the rehearsal dinner venue had been changed. Mother found a much better place. More exclusive, but it requires final confirmation today. Drake nodded amiably. Whatever you think is best. And there's been a slight change to the reception's seating, she continued, watching him carefully. You'll be at a table with the venue staff supervisors to ensure everything goes smoothly. The staff table, Drake repeated calmly, rather than with family. It's a special responsibility, Pamela said, her eyes gleaming with poorly concealed malice. Mother and I agreed you'd be perfect for it. Drake sipped his coffee. And my place card? Or name tag, rather. Pamela couldn't quite hide her surprise. You know about the name tags? Zoe mentioned it. Unusual choice for a formal wedding. Pamela recovered quickly. Just a personal touch. More memorable. Indeed, Drake agreed. I'm sure it will be unforgettable. That evening, Drake met with Judge Porter again, this time at the Judges Club, a discreet establishment frequented by Chicago's legal community. They're moving forward with their plan, Drake informed him quietly, including the attempt to use your courtroom as part of their scheme. Porter's expression darkened. I've made some discreet inquiries since our last conversation. Disturbing patterns emerged regarding Mr. Blackwood's previous legal entanglements and their convenient resolutions. I'm not surprised, Drake replied. The question is, what happens at the wedding? I won't disrupt Zoe and Ben's day, but I also won't allow myself to be publicly humiliated as part of their larger plot. Porter considered this. Benjamin and Zoe deserve their day. Nothing should overshadow that. He paused. Perhaps a preemptive measure is warranted. What do you suggest? Drake asked. A private conversation with my former colleague, Judge Carlton, who now oversees the SEC's Chicago Enforcement Division. Purely hypothetical, of course. Drake nodded, understanding. I appreciate your perspective, Your Honor. Porter fixed him with a steady gaze. Mr. Calloway, I've presided over enough cases to recognize when someone is building toward justice rather than mere revenge. Whatever happens, I trust you'll maintain that distinction. I intend to, Drake assured him. Justice first. But justice isn't always gentle. 1 week before the wedding, everything was in place. Drake had secured his business, documented the conspiracy, prepared legal countermeasures, and established a clear record of Pamela's betrayal. Blackwood was off balance, uncertain of Drake's knowledge or intentions. Pamela was increasingly agitated, aware that something was wrong, but unable to identify what. The final phase would execute at the wedding itself. Drake reviewed the plan one last time with his team, ensuring every detail was perfect. Once this is done, Lyle warned, there's no going back. Your marriage, your relationship with Pamela's family. Already destroyed, Drake said firmly. They did that, not me. And Zoe, Charlotte asked gently, how will she handle this? Drake's expression softened slightly. She deserves the truth. All of it. It will be painful, but she's stronger than Pamela gives her credit for. He checked his watch. The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow night. Everyone knows their roles. They nodded solemnly. Then we're ready, Drake concluded. 25 years in Saturday. And something new begins. Chapter 5. Rehearsals and Revelations. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Lake Point Terrace, an exclusive venue overlooking Lake Michigan with floor-to-ceiling windows capturing Chicago's sparkling skyline. As Drake had suspected, the last-minute venue change placed them in a restaurant partially owned by Maxwell Blackwood, a power play designed to make Blackwood feel comfortable on his own territory. Drake arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit that Charlotte had specially modified. The hidden camera was undetectable, the microphone pickup crystal clear, and the lightweight recording equipment distributed so perfectly that even the most discerning eye would notice nothing unusual. Showtime, he murmured to himself as he entered the private dining room. The scene was picture perfect, Zoe radiant in a cream-colored cocktail dress, Ben attentive at her side. The Porter family clustered near the windows, Judge Porter stoic but proud, his sister and her husband making small talk with Ben's cousins. On the opposite side, Pamela held court with Vivian Keller and their social circle, her laughter carrying across the room with practiced musicality. And standing slightly apart, champagne in hand, Maxwell Blackwood observed the gathering like a general surveying a battlefield. He nodded slightly at Drake's entrance, raising his glass in acknowledgement. Drake approached Zoe first, kissing her cheek. You look beautiful, sweetheart. Thanks, Dad. She beamed, though he noted the slight tension around her eyes. Everything okay? Mom's been acting weird all day. Pre-wedding nerves, Drake assured her. Nothing for you to worry about. Judge Porter approached, extending his hand. Calloway, good to see you. Their handshake conveyed a silent understanding. Likewise, Judge. Looking forward to tomorrow's celebration. Indeed, Porter replied meaningfully. I expect it will be quite revealing for everyone involved. As dinner commenced, Drake found himself seated between Vivian Keller and one of Pamela's college friends, directly across from Blackwood, a seating arrangement clearly designed to force uncomfortable proximity. Drake, Vivian addressed him with barely concealed disdain. At 70, she remained formidable. Steel gray hair perfectly coiffed, jewelry substantial without being ostentatious, her posture radiating old money confidence. Pamela tells me you've been having troubles with your company lately. How unfortunate. Nothing substantial, Drake replied pleasantly, activating the recording function with a discreet tap to his cufflink. Business has its challenges, especially in development, Blackwood interjected smoothly. Competition can be fierce. Indeed, Drake agreed, meeting his gaze directly. Though I've always believed the strongest foundations are built on integrity, not opportunism. Vivian's lips thinned. Such quaint notions in today's business climate. Throughout dinner, the provocations continued, veiled references to Drake's supposedly imminent business troubles, comments about his absence from wedding planning, subtle positioning of Blackwood as a more engaged figure in family matters. Drake absorbed it all, responding with measured pleasantness while his equipment captured every damning word in exchange. Pamela grew increasingly frustrated with his composure, her attempts to provoke him growing less subtle as the evening progressed. After the main course, she approached his seat, resting her hand possessively on Blackwood's shoulder. Max has been such a help with the wedding arrangements, she announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. I don't know what we would have done without him. So much more available than some people. I'm grateful for anyone who contributes to Zoe's happiness. Drake replied evenly, noting the flash of uncertainty in Blackwood's eyes. The planned speeches began. Ben spoke lovingly of Zoe, his sincerity evident in every word. Zoe responded with equal warmth, thanking both families for their support. Judge Porter offered dignified congratulations. Then Pamela rose, champagne glass in hand. "Tomorrow marks a new beginning for our family," she announced, her gaze sweeping the room before settling challengingly on Drake. Some chapters and so new ones can begin. Some roles change. Some truths finally come alight. The double meaning was clear to those in the know, though most guests simply smiled at what seemed like typical mother-of-the-bride sentiments. When it was Drake's turn, he stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Tomorrow, my daughter marries a fine man from an honorable family. Nothing is more important than that central truth." He raised his glass. "To Zoe and Ben, may your foundation be strong, your walls sturdy, and your roof protect you from life's storms. And may you always remember that true partnerships are built on honesty, loyalty, and mutual respect." He locked eyes with Pamela as he finished, because without those elements, even the grandest structures eventually collapse. As the evening wound down, Drake executed the next phase of his plan. He approached Maxwell Blackwood at the bar, ensuring they were just out of earshot of others, but still visible. "Have you considered my proposal?" Drake asked, keeping his expression neutral. Blackwood swirled his scotch. "The Richardson Project? It has merit from a business perspective, but timing might be problematic." "Timing," Drake repeated. Interesting choice of words. Time has a way of revealing things, doesn't it? Secrets, schemes, betrayals. Blackwood's composure slipped momentarily. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Drake." "I think you are." Drake moved slightly closer, his voice dropping. "The wedding is tomorrow. My daughter's special day. If anything happens to disrupt that event, to cause her pain or embarrassment, the consequences will be significant." "Are you threatening me?" Blackwood's voice remained low, but his knuckles whitened around his glass. "Not at all. Simply sharing an observation about cause and effect." Drake smiled thinly. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Max. I'm sure tomorrow will be unforgettable for everyone involved." As Drake turned to leave, Blackwood caught his arm. "She doesn't love you anymore, Drake. Hasn't for years. Whatever you think you know, whatever you're planning, that fact won't change." Drake looked pointedly at Blackwood's hand until he released his grip. "Love isn't my concern at this point. Max Justice is." The final confrontation came as guests were departing. Drake found Pamela in the coat room, checking her reflection in the mirror. "Lovely evening," he commented, closing the door behind him. She turned, her expression guarded. "Yes, everything went perfectly." "Almost." Drake leaned against the wall. "Just one question, Pamela. The name tag you've arranged for me tomorrow. Housekeeper, isn't it?" "Not very subtle." The color drained from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. Just like you know about the staff table placement. The plan to humiliate me. The scheme with Blackwood to destroy my company after you served divorce papers." Her shock quickly transformed into defiance. "You can't prove anything." "I already have." Drake stepped closer. "Meeting. Conversation. Financial transaction. Leaked contract. I know everything, Pamela. Have for months." For a moment, genuine fear flickered across her features before she recovered. "If that were true, you would have acted already." "Who says I haven't?" Drake smiled coldly. "Tomorrow's your big performance. I wouldn't dream of stopping it. In fact, I'm looking forward to seeing exactly how it plays out." "You're bluffing," she said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Am I? Guess we'll find out tomorrow." Drake opened the door. "Oh, and Pamela, I'll wear whatever name tag you've prepared. Consider it my wedding gift to you, one last chance to feel like you've won." Late that night, Drake received a flurry of updates from his team. Miriam reported an emergency meeting between Pamela, Blackwood, and Vivian, though she couldn't get close enough for audio. Charlotte confirmed that their legal preparations were complete, with Stanley Goldman ready to move on Drake's signal. Lau reported that Thornhill had resurfaced, spotted at Blackwood's office that afternoon. "They're panicking," Drake told them, "but they're committed to the plan. Too much preparation, too many moving pieces to abandon now." Are you sure about tomorrow? Charlotte asked. The confrontation at the wedding could ruin Zoe's day. Drake sighed, the weight of his decision evident. Zoe deserves a perfect wedding, but she also deserves the truth. And sometimes those things can't coexist. He checked his watch. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging for all of us. As dawn broke on his daughter's wedding day, Drake stood at his bedroom window, watching the early morning light illuminate the lake. 25 years of marriage ending. A conspiracy to destroy him about to be exposed. A performance of public humiliation transformed into his moment of truth. He felt strangely calm, the tranquility of absolute certainty. Whatever happened today, Pamela, Vivian, and Blackwood would never forget the consequences of targeting Drake Calloway and using his daughter's wedding as their weapon. Chapter 6. Unveiled. St. Bartholomew's Cathedral was resplendent, filled with flowers and music as Chicago's elite gathered to witness Zoe Calloway marry Benjamin Porter. Drake participated in the ceremony with dignity, walking his daughter down the aisle with genuine pride, his emotions for her untainted by the storm he knew was coming. "I love you, Dad," Zoe whispered before he placed her hand in Ben's. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than anything." He stepped back, taking his place in the front pew, feeling Pamela's cold presence beside him like a gathering storm. The ceremony was beautiful, traditional, and mercifully free of drama. Judge Porter officiated with surprising warmth, his judicial demeanor softening as he pronounced his son and Zoe husband and wife. For that brief period, the conspiracies and betrayals faded into the background, allowing the genuine love between the young couple to shine. It was during the professional photographs outside the cathedral that Drake observed Pamela and Vivian in an intense conversation with the wedding planner, pointing repeatedly at documents that Drake knew contained the final seating arrangements and reception details. Vivian's expression was smug, Pamela's triumphant. The reception was held at the Conrad Grand Ballroom, its Art Deco splendor providing a dramatic backdrop for the celebration. As guests arrived, they were directed to a table where elegant name tags awaited them. Heavy cardstock with gold lettering, attached with discreet magnetic fasteners. Drake approached the table with purpose, nodding politely to the attendant. "Drake Calloway," he stated. The young woman rifled through the alphabetized tags before finding his. Her expression flickered with confusion as she read it, hesitating before handing it over. Drake examined the tag, which indeed read "Housekeeper" in elegant gold script. He smiled, pinning it to his lapel without comment. "Is there a problem, sir?" the attendant asked uncertainly. "Not at all," Drake assured her. "Everything is exactly as expected." He made his way through the gathering crowd, nodding to acquaintances, accepting congratulations with grace. He noted with grim amusement how conversations faltered as people noticed his name tag, confusion and embarrassment crossing their faces. Pamela intercepted him near the bar, her smile vicious beneath her social veneer. "Oh dear, there seems to have been a mix-up with your tag." Her voice carried just enough for nearby guests to hear. "No mix-up," Drake replied calmly. "Just clarity about how you see my role in our family." Very illuminating. Her smile faltered slightly. "Don't make a scene, Drake. Not at Zoe's wedding. I wouldn't dream of it." He glanced across the room to where Blackwood was watching them intently. "Though I'm curious, when exactly did you plan to serve the divorce papers? Before or after the SEC raids my office on Monday?" The color drained from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do." Drake sipped his whiskey. "The fake financial records. The manufactured evidence of fraud. Judge Porter's court carefully selected through your mother's connections. It's quite a scheme you three concocted." Before she could respond, the wedding planner announced that guests should find their tables for dinner. Drake allowed himself to be directed to a small table near the kitchen doors, clearly separated from the family and distinguished guests. His table mates were indeed venue staff supervisors, looking uncomfortable at having the father of the bride seated with them. "Please, don't be concerned," Drake assured them. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the head table where Zoe and Ben sat with their wedding party, and the adjacent table of honor where Pamela, Vivian, and Maxwell Blackwood held court. The message was unmistakable to anyone who understood family dynamics. Drake Calloway had been deliberately excluded, diminished, reduced to staff at his own daughter's wedding. Dinner proceeded with excruciating formality. Drake ate little, instead watching the room with hawk-like attention. He observed Zoe's increasingly puzzled glances toward his isolated table. He noted Judge Porter's cold stare directed at Vivian Keller, and he registered the moment when Blackwood leaned over to whisper something in Pamela's ear that made her laugh triumphantly. After the main course, Vivian Keller rose to tap her glass, silencing the room. Before we continue with the traditional speeches, I have a special announcement. Her aristocratic voice carried effortlessly. The Keller Foundation, in recognition of extraordinary contributions to Chicago's architectural landscape, is presenting a Special Achievement Award to Maxwell Blackwood of Westlake Development. Polite applause filled the room as Blackwood stood, accepting the small crystal trophy with practiced humility. "Thank you, Vivian, for this unexpected honor," he began. "While today is rightfully focused on Zoe and Benjamin's future, I'm deeply grateful for this recognition, and I'm especially thankful to have been welcomed so warmly into the Keller family's circle over these past months." His eyes flickered briefly to Pamela, who raised her champagne glass slightly in acknowledgement. The gesture, while subtle, was intimate enough that several guests exchanged glances. Drake checked his watch. The moment had arrived. He stood unhurriedly, straightening his jacket. The housekeeper tag gleamed on his lapel as he walked deliberately toward the head table. Conversations quieted as people noticed his approach, the atmosphere tensing like the moment before a thunderclap. Drake stopped directly before the table where Pamela, Vivian, and Blackwood sat. For a moment, he simply stood there, his expression unreadable as he surveyed them. Pamela's smile became fixed, brittle with underlying panic. "Drake," she hissed, "return to your table. You're embarrassing yourself." He turned slightly, ensuring his voice would carry. "When I attended my daughter's wedding, my name tag said housekeeper." His tone was conversational, measured. My mother-in-law smirked. "You're just a servant here." The room grew eerily quiet. "Worse, I had no meal," Drake continued, gesturing to the nearly empty plate that had been served at his isolated table. My wife giggled. "Food is for real family." Pamela half rose. "Drake, you're making a scene. Think of Zoe." "I am thinking of Zoe," Drake replied. "She deserves the truth." He turned to address the stunned guests. I stood up, took off my ring, and said, "Before I go, I want you to see this video." With practiced precision, Drake activated his cufflink. The ballroom's video screens, originally intended for wedding photos, flickered to life, displaying crystal-clear footage of Pamela and Maxwell Blackwood in intimate embrace, followed by audio recordings of their conspiracy conversations. The name tag will say housekeeper. Pamela's recorded voice filled the ballroom. Mother will make sure he's seated at the staff table. And the next morning, while he's nursing his wounded pride, the SEC shows up at his office with the evidence we've manufactured. Vivian Keller surged to her feet. "Turn that off immediately. This is outrageous." "What? That's not real," Pamela shouted, her face contorted with rage and panic. The screens changed to display financial records, email exchanges, and documented evidence of the conspiracy to frame Drake for financial crimes. Drake removed his wedding ring, placing it deliberately on the table. Then I served my cheating wife with divorce papers and left. On cue, Stanley Goldman approached with a leather portfolio, extracting legal documents which he placed before Pamela. She warned she would destroy me. Drake continued, his voice carrying in the shocked silence. But I had already planned my revenge. The screens now displayed evidence of Blackwood's actual financial fraud, documentation of materials theft from Drake projects, and Pamela's systematic withdrawal of funds from joint accounts. Blackwood lunged for Drake, his composure entirely shattered. "You smug bastard. You think this proves anything?" Judge Porter's authoritative voice cut through the chaos. "It proves quite enough, Mr. Blackwood." He had risen from his seat, every inch the federal judge. Enough that I've already contacted the appropriate authorities regarding the apparent attempt to manipulate my court for fraudulent purposes. Pamela turned to Drake, her expression a mixture of hatred and fear. You've ruined everything. You'll regret this. No, Pamela, Drake replied calmly. You ruined our marriage when you betrayed me. You ruined your reputation when you conspired against me. And you ruined your relationship with Zoe when you tried to use her wedding as a weapon. He turned to face his daughter, who stood frozen in shock beside her new husband. Zoe, I'm sorry. This should have been just your day. But they left me no choice. The room erupted into chaos, guests whispering furiously, Vivian shouting for security, Blackwood attempting to flee only to find Lyle, and 2 private security officers blocking his path. Drake removed the housekeeper tag from his lapel, dropping it onto the table beside his discarded wedding ring. 25 years, Pamela, and this is how you chose to end it. As he turned to leave, Zoe broke away from the head table, rushing to intercept him. Dad, wait. Her eyes were wide with confusion and hurt. What is all this? What's happening? Drake took her hands gently. The truth, sweetheart. Ugly and poorly timed, but necessary. Your mother and Blackwood have been involved for nearly a year. They plan to use your wedding to humiliate me, then destroy my company through fabricated evidence of financial crimes. Tears welled in Zoe's eyes. But why would Mom do this? Why today of all days? Power, money, a new life with Blackwood built on the ruins of mine. Drake squeezed her hands. I tried to protect you from this knowledge, but when they decided to use your wedding as their stage, I had no choice but to respond in kind. Ben appeared at Zoe's side, his expression grim but supportive as he placed an arm around his new wife. Mr. Calloway, he said formally, my father has explained some of this to me. While the timing is difficult, I understand you are left with few options. Drake nodded gratefully. I'm sorry to both of you. This should have been just about your love, your future. Zoe's shock was transforming into anger, not at Drake, but at her mother. She turned to watch as Pamela continued to shout denials despite the damning evidence still displayed on the screens. Go, Zoe told Drake softly. Leave before security arrives. I'll call you tomorrow. Drake kissed her forehead. I love you, Zoe. That has never and will never change. As he walked toward the exit, Charlotte met him with his overcoat. Phase 3 initiated, she murmured. SEC agents are already at Blackwood's office. Police have been notified about the financial fraud evidence. In the other matter? Drake asked quietly. Judge Porter's clerk delivered the documentation to the district attorney 10 minutes ago, with his personal recommendation for immediate action. Drake nodded, taking one last look at the ballroom. Pamela, Vivian, and Blackwood remained at the center of a storm of confusion and accusation. Judge Porter was speaking intensely with security personnel, his judicial authority evident in their deferential postures. And Zoe stood with Ben, her face tear-streaked, but her posture increasingly resolute as she absorbed the truth about her mother's betrayal. Let's go, Drake told Charlotte. The rest will unfold without us now. As they stepped into the cool evening air, Drake felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only the weary relief of a man who had faced treachery with truth, betrayal with justice. The war was won, but the battlefield remained in ruins. Chapter 7, Shockwaves. Drake awoke in the guest suite of Lyle's lakefront condo, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before the events of the previous day crashed back into his consciousness. His daughter's wedding, the public confrontation, the evidence revealed. His marriage officially terminated after 25 years. He checked his phone. 17 missed calls, 32 text messages, 46 emails. Chicago's social and business circles were in meltdown. Drake set the phone aside without reading any of it. Lyle appeared in the doorway, offering a steaming mug of coffee. How you holding up? Drake accepted the coffee gratefully. Survived worse. Debatable. Lyle settled into an armchair. Pretty epic nuclear option you deployed yesterday. Half the city's talking about it, and the other half, pretending they're not, while secretly getting all the details. Lyle's weathered face creased with concern. Stanley called. Police picked up Blackwood last night. pending charges for financial fraud, corporate espionage, attempted evidence tampering. They're looking for Thornhill too, but he's in the wind. Drake nodded. Pamela, holed up at her mother's estate in Lake Forest. Vivian's attorney has been making threatening calls, but it's mostly bluster. Lyle hesitated. Zoe tried to reach you around midnight. Drake closed his eyes briefly. The one casualty he regretted, his daughter's perfect day shattered by the ugliness of adult betrayals. I'll call her when things settle. There's something else, Lyle said carefully. News vans outside your house. Reporters calling the office. This thing's gone viral, Drake. Of course it had. A high society wedding turned public scandal involving two of Chicago's most prominent business figures, complete with infidelity, conspiracy, and financial crimes. It was catnip to the media. Charlotte's implementing the crisis management protocol, Lyle continued. But you'll need to make some decisions soon about how to handle the publicity. Drake set down his coffee. First things first. I need to secure what's mine. Has Garrett confirmed that all accounts are protected? Lock down tight. Pamela can't access anything connected to you or the company. And the job sites. Additional security in place at all locations. No incidents so far. Drake nodded, mentally ticking through his priority list. I need to speak with key clients today. Reassure them that projects continue unaffected. Then meet with the management team to address any concerns. And the personal stuff? Lyle asked gently. The house. Your belongings. Drake hadn't even considered the practical aspects of his marriage's implosion. The shared home, possessions accumulated over 25 years, the mundane logistics of separated lives. I'll send a security team to collect essential items, he decided. The rest can wait until the legal dust settles. By noon, Drake had established a temporary command center in Lyle's dining room. Charlotte arrived with 3 assistants, laptops, secure phones, and a meticulously organized action plan. We've identified 3 primary narrative threads in the media coverage, she reported, displaying a color-coded analysis on her tablet. Business scandal, society scandal, and legal proceedings. Our strategy addresses each separately while maintaining consistent messaging across all channels. Drake studied the document. No personal interviews. No comments on the marriage beyond the prepared statement. Focus communication on business continuity and cooperation with authorities. Exactly, Charlotte nodded. We've also prepared talking points for all senior managers and site supervisors. Everyone stays on message. Drake turned to Garrett, who had joined them via secure video call. What's the financial impact assessment? Stock took a 15% hit this morning, Garrett reported grimly. Expected, given the circumstances. But our fundamentals remain strong. The materials theft and contract interference evidence actually works in our favor, positions us as victims rather than perpetrators. The Richardson Block project? Cities placed the bidding process on hold pending the investigation into Blackwood's companies. We're still in contention once it resumes. Drake absorbed this information, mentally calculating next steps. And the SEC investigation Blackwood was planning to trigger. Completely defused, Garrett assured him. Judge Porter's intervention was key. He made sure the right people understood that the evidence was fabricated as part of a personal vendetta. A text message alert drew Drake's attention back to his phone. Zoe, can we talk? Alone. He replied immediately. Name the time and place. Her response came quickly. Promontory Point. 3 p.m. Drake looked up at his team. I need 2 hours this afternoon. Personal matter. Charlotte nodded, understanding. We'll hold the fort. At precisely 3 p.m., Drake stood at Promontory Point, the Lake Michigan wind buffeting his coat as he gazed across the steel-gray water. This spot held significance. He had brought Zoe here countless times during her childhood, teaching her to skip stones and build driftwood sculptures along the rocky shore. He sensed her arrival before he saw her. Thanks for coming, he said without turning. Zoe moved to stand beside him, her face pale but composed. She wore casual clothes, jeans, boots, an oversized sweater, a stark contrast to yesterday's bridal elegance. Ben's covering my shift, she said. I have an hour before I need to be back at the hospital. They stood in silence for a moment, both watching the restless lake. "So," she finally said, "yesterday happened." Drake nodded. "It did. You humiliated Mom in front of everyone." "I exposed the truth," Drake corrected gently. "There's a difference." Zoe turned to face him, her expression troubled. "I'm not defending what she did. The affair, the conspiracy, using my wedding as some kind of battleground. It's inexcusable." She hugged herself against the wind. "But did it have to happen like that? In front of everyone I know? On my wedding day?" Drake considered his answer carefully. 3 weeks ago, I discovered their plan to use your wedding to publicly humiliate me, then destroy my company and reputation immediately after. I had limited options, limited time. You could have told me beforehand, Zoe argued. Warn me, and place you in an impossible position between your parents on your wedding day. Drake shook his head. I couldn't do that to you. So instead you turned my reception into a scandal that's all over the news. Her voice cracked slightly. Ben and I can't even leave our apartment without reporters shouting questions. Drake felt the weight of that consequence. I'm sorry for that part, truly. I focused so much on countering their attack that I underestimated the collateral damage. He reached for her hand. If I could have found another way that didn't hurt you, I would have taken it. Zoe didn't pull away, but her expression remained troubled. Mom called me this morning. She's claiming most of your evidence is fabricated or manipulated, that you're having some kind of breakdown driven by jealousy. Drake laughed hollowly. Of course she is. What did you tell her? That I need time. That I don't know what to believe. Zoe met his gaze directly. Tell me honestly, Dad, is everything you showed yesterday genuine? Unaltered? The complete truth? Every recording, document, piece of evidence is authentic and contextually accurate, Drake confirmed. Collected legally through licensed professionals. Verified by multiple sources. There was no manipulation, no fabrication. Zoe searched his face, then nodded slowly. I believe you. The simple statement loosened something in Drake's chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. What happens now, she asked. With the business? With you and Mom? With everything. Legally, the divorce proceeds. Your mother will likely contest it despite the evidence, dragging things out. Drake gazed back toward the city skyline. Blackwood faces criminal charges for the financial crimes. Some of his assets may be frozen during investigation. And your company? Continues. We've weathered worse storms. He squeezed her hand. But none of that matters as much as you, Zoe. Whatever happens between your mother and me, you're still our daughter. I'll never ask you to choose sides or cut contact with her. Tears finally spilled on his Zoe's cheeks. She used my wedding, Dad. She used me. How do I ever trust her again? Drake pulled her into a hug, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs. That's a question only you can answer, sweetheart. In your own time, in your own way. As they parted, Zoe wiped her eyes. Ben and I are canceling the honeymoon. It's impossible now with the media attention, and I can't leave my patients for that long with everything so chaotic. Don't do that, Drake said firmly. Take your honeymoon. Start your marriage away from all this. It's not that simple. It can be. Drake pulled out his phone, typing a brief message. I have a private property in northern Michigan. Completely secluded, fully staffed. No address listed publicly. You and Ben can go there instead of Bali. Same time frame, just a different location. Hope flickered across Zoe's face. You do that? Of course. The arrangements can be made within hours. He smiled slightly. Consider it my real wedding gift. As they walked back toward the parking area, Zoe asked, Where are you staying? Not at the house. Temporarily with Lyle. I'll find something more permanent soon. She nodded, processing this new reality. Her parents truly separated, lives diverging after decades together. Will you be okay, Dad? Drake considered the question with genuine reflection. The public humiliation had been averted, the business conspiracy exposed, the legal traps defused. But 25 years of his life had still ended, leaving wounds that victory couldn't completely heal. I will be, he answered honestly. Not immediately, but eventually. After Zoe left, Drake remained at Promontory Point, watching darkness gather over the lake. His phone buzzed. Stanley Goldman. Judge Carlton signed the emergency injunction, Stanley reported without preamble. Blackwood's assets are frozen pending investigation. His bail hearing is tomorrow morning. In the other matter, restraining order against Pamela has been filed. She can't enter any of your properties or offices. Can't contact you directly. Drake nodded, though Stanley couldn't see him. Good. What about Thornhill? Still missing, but his accounts show a large cash withdrawal yesterday morning. Airport security has him boarding a flight to Mexico City. Have our people there keep watching, Drake instructed. He'll surface eventually. After ending the call, Drake had one more conversation to make. He dialed Judge Porter's private number. Calloway. Porter answered crisply. I was expecting your call. I wanted to thank you. Drake said simply. Your intervention made a difference. Justice matters to me, Porter replied, as does family. Benjamin tells me Zoe is understandably shaken, but coping admirably. She's stronger than she knows, Drake agreed. How are you handling the professional implications? Porter's voice held grim satisfaction. I've formally recused myself from any matters involving Blackwood's companies, of course. But I've also filed a detailed ethics complaint regarding the attempted manipulation of judicial assignments. The chief judge is displeased with certain colleagues who were apparently influenced by Vivian Keller. The ripples spread wide, Drake observed. Indeed, Porter paused. For what it's worth, Calloway, you handled an impossible situation with more restraint than many would have shown. The evidence could have been far more damaging, far more personal. Drake thought of the explicit text messages and compromising photos he had chosen not to display. The deeply personal conversations he had kept private. Even in his righteous anger, he had maintained certain boundaries. Some things should remain private, he said simply. Even in war. A philosophy many would benefit from adopting, Porter noted. Good evening, Calloway. That night, as Drake reviewed business reports in Lyle's guest room, Charlotte sent a final update before retiring. Blackwood Development stock down 43% at close. 3 board members resigned. Major clients suspending contracts pending investigation. Pamela attempted to access vacation property in Harbor Springs. Access denied per security protocol. Judge Carlton has scheduled emergency hearing regarding evidence preservation tomorrow at 9 a.m. Our legal team fully prepared. The systematic dismantling of Blackwood's empire had begun. The consequences of targeting Drake Calloway were becoming painfully clear to everyone involved. Drake closed his laptop, allowing himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had countered their attack without becoming like them, without sacrificing his integrity or stooping to their level of personal cruelty. Justice, not mere revenge. As difficult as the path ahead remained, he had maintained that crucial distinction. Chapter 8. Counterstrikes. 3 days after the wedding, Chicago awakened to front-page headlines. Blackwood charged. Developer faces multiple felony counts. Society wedding scandal exposes corporate conspiracy. Calloway Construction stock rebounds as evidence confirms company was targeted. Drake reviewed the coverage from his newly established temporary office in a corporate apartment building owned by his company. The space was impersonal but functional, a blank slate unburdened by memories or emotional associations. Charlotte entered, carrying coffee and a thick folder. The PR team has analyzed all major coverage. Sentiment is shifting strongly in our favor as more details of Blackwood's fraudulent activities emerge. And the personal aspects? Drake asked, knowing that Chicago's gossip machine would be equally focused on the marriage implosion. Mixed but stabilizing. Initial shock at the public nature of the revelation is giving way to understanding of your position. Several prominent society figures have privately expressed support. She handed him the folder. These require your immediate attention. Client reassurance calls, project approvals, staffing adjustments to cover the gaps left by terminated employees. Drake nodded, scanning the documents. Schedule the calls for this afternoon. I'll review the project materials now. There's one more thing, Charlotte said carefully. Pamela's attorney called. She's contesting the divorce terms, claiming duress and misrepresentation. Drake looked up. unsurprised but irritated. Of course she is. Forward everything to Stanley. No direct engagement from our side. After Charlotte left, Drake gazed out at the Chicago skyline, the architectural tapestry he had helped shape over decades of work. Some of his buildings gleamed in the morning light, solid testaments to his vision and persistence. Now, like those structures, he would need to rebuild his personal life from a new foundation. His phone rang. Miriam Sloan. "We've located Thornhill," the investigator reported without preamble. "He's in Puerto Vallarta, using a credit card under his mother's maiden name. Local contact has visual confirmation and is maintaining surveillance. Good work. Keep tracking him, but no contact yet. I have other plans for Mr. Thornhill." Drake's next call was to Judge Porter, who answered with his customary briskness. "The restraining order against your wife has been extended," Porter informed him, "and the evidence preservation order regarding Blackwood's financial records is being strictly enforced despite his legal team's objections." "Thank you for the update. How's Ben handling the situation?" Porter's voice softened slightly. "Better than expected. He's a doctor, accustomed to dealing with difficult realities, and he's primarily concerned with Zoe's well-being." "As am I," Drake assured him. "They're my Michigan property now, completely private, away from media attention." "A thoughtful solution," Porter acknowledged. "Calloway, there's something else you should know. My former clerk reports that Vivian Keller has been making calls to several judges, attempting to influence the trajectory of both the criminal cases and your divorce proceedings." Drake frowned. "Can she be stopped?" "Already in motion. The Judicial Ethics Committee has been quietly notified. Vivian's influence may have been substantial in social circles, but the judiciary takes manipulation attempts very seriously." "I appreciate the information." After completing his morning calls, Drake met with Lyle and Garrett to assess the company's position. The news was surprisingly positive. The stock had recovered most of its initial losses. Key projects remained on schedule, and clients have been largely reassured by Drake's personal outreach. "The narrative is working in our favor," Garrett explained, displaying analytics on his tablet. "You're being positioned as the wronged party who exposed corruption rather than perpetrated it. The business community respects decisive action, even if the social consequences were messy." Speaking of messy, Lyle interjected, "Pamela made another attempt to access joint financial accounts this morning. When denied, she apparently became quite vocal with the bank manager." Drake shook his head. "She still doesn't understand that her old tactics won't work anymore." Their meeting was interrupted by an urgent call from Stanley Goldman. "Drake, Blackwood made bail," the attorney reported tensely. $5 million, posted by some shell corporation, we're still tracing. He's restricted from leaving the state and surrendered his passport, but he's out." Drake absorbed this news calmly. Expected. His team will fight aggressively. There's more. He held an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps, claiming persecution and vowing to expose the truth about Drake Calloway's vendetta against him. "Send me the footage," Drake requested. "And Stanley? Accelerate our counterfiling against Pamela. No more measured responses. Full disclosure of all evidence in the court record." After reviewing Blackwood's defiant press statement, Drake summoned his crisis team for an emergency strategy session. The developer had appeared haggard but combative, portraying himself as the victim of a jealous husband's elaborate revenge scheme. "He's trying to reframe the narrative," Charlotte observed. "Make this about a personal grudge rather than his actual crimes." "Expected but ineffective," Drake responded. "The financial evidence is too substantial to dismiss as fabrication." His own partners are already distancing themselves. "Still, public perception matters," Garrett cautioned, "especially with the high-profile nature of this situation." Drake considered their position carefully. "We maintain our current strategy, factual, business-focused communication. No personal attacks, no emotional responses. Let the evidence and legal proceedings speak for themselves." His phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source. Maxwell Blackwood himself. "This isn't over, Drake. You won a first round, but I still have cards to play. Willing to discuss terms if you are. Mutual damage control." Drake showed the message to his team. "He's fishing," Lyle said immediately. looking for any opening to negotiate his way out of criminal charges. Or setting up a trap, Charlotte suggested. Recording conversations to twist later. Drake typed a simple response. All communication through respective legal counsel only. The blocked number buzzed again almost immediately. Pride before the fall, Drake. Your daughter's reputation is still at stake. Think carefully. Drake's expression hardened. He's threatening Zoe now. Empty threat, Garrett assured him. She's completely insulated from this legally. But not socially or emotionally, Drake noted grimly. Charlotte, contact our security team. I want protection details on Zoe and Ben when they return from Michigan. And notify Judge Porter of this implicit threat. That evening, Drake received another unexpected call from Vivian Keller. You've made your point, Drake, she began without greeting, her aristocratic voice tight with controlled fury. You've embarrassed my daughter, damaged Maxwell's business, and created a spectacle that will take months to overcome. Surely that's sufficient revenge for whatever perceived slight you're nursing. Drake leaned back in his chair. Interesting perspective, Vivian. Completely detached from reality, but interesting nonetheless. Don't be flippant with me, she snapped. I'm offering you a civilized resolution. Withdraw the most damaging allegations. Agree to a quiet divorce settlement. And we can all move forward without further unpleasantness. The unpleasantness, as you call it, involves documented conspiracy, financial crimes, and the weaponization of my daughter's wedding. Drake replied coldly. Those aren't allegations. They're facts supported by extensive evidence. And they have consequences. Everyone makes mistakes, Drake. Even you. Some things aren't mistakes, Vivian. They're choices. Deliberate, calculated choices that reflect character. Drake's voice hardened. You and Pamela chose to try destroying me. You chose to use Zoe's wedding as your battlefield. You chose to align with a man who commits financial fraud as standard business practice. You self-righteous bastard, Vivian hissed, her composure finally cracking. You were never good enough for my daughter. Never part of our world despite your money and your buildings. Always the contractor who got lucky, the outsider playing at belonging. And there it is, Drake said quietly. The truth behind 25 years of undermining and contempt. Thank you for the clarity, Vivian. This isn't over, she warned. You have no idea the influences I can bring to bear. Actually, I do. Your calls to certain judges have already been flagged by the Judicial Ethics Committee. Your foundation's relationship with Blackwood's companies is being scrutinized by regulatory authorities. Your social influence is rapidly diminishing as people distance themselves from a scandal. Drake paused. You should be more concerned with damage control than empty threats at this point. After ending the call, Drake found himself unexpectedly drained. The emotional toll of the past week was finally catching up to him. The end of his marriage, the public confrontation, the continuing battle to protect what he'd built. He poured himself a rare glass of scotch and stepped onto the apartment's balcony, gazing at the city lights. Chicago had been the canvas for his life's work, the place where he'd built something from nothing through sheer determination and vision. Now, it was also the backdrop for his most personal failure, a marriage that had deteriorated into betrayal and vindictiveness. His phone rang again. Zoe. Hey, sweetheart, he answered, his voice softening immediately. How's Michigan? Beautiful. Peaceful. She sounded calmer than during their last conversation. Thank you for arranging this, Dad. We needed the escape. Anything for you, Zoe. You know that. She was quiet for a moment. Mom's been calling repeatedly. When I finally answered, she wanted me to help convince you to be reasonable about the divorce settlement. Drake sighed. I'm sorry she's putting you in that position. You shouldn't be involved in our legal matters. That's what I told her. Zoe's voice strengthened. I said I wasn't taking sides, but I also wasn't going to be her messenger or negotiator. Good for you, Drake said, proud of her boundary setting. How did she take it? Not well. Lots of crying about how everyone's abandoning her when she needs support. Zoe paused. It was manipulative. I've never seen that side of her so clearly before. Drake remained silent, letting Zoe process this realization in her own way. Anyway, she continued after a moment, I also called because Ben and I decided to extend our stay here for another week. Is that okay? Of course. Stay as long as you need. And Dad? When we get back. She hesitated. I'd like to have dinner with you. Just us. To talk about everything more openly now that I've had time to process. Name a time and place, Drake promised. I'll be there. After their call ended, Drake received an update from Miriam. Thornhill had made contact with someone from Blackwood's organization in Puerto Vallarta. The surveillance photos showed them an intense conversation at a beachfront restaurant. Drake studied the images thoughtfully. Thornhill was a crucial loose end, someone with direct knowledge of both the materials theft and the manufactured evidence against Drake's company. His testimony could be damaging if Blackwood managed to manipulate or incentivize him properly. Time to reel him in, Drake murmured to himself, sending instructions to Miriam for the next phase. The following morning brought news that shifted the battlefield once again. The SEC had expanded its investigation into Blackwood development, freezing additional accounts and issuing subpoenas for records related to 7 major projects over the past 3 years. Simultaneously, 3 of Blackwood's board members publicly resigned, citing recently discovered irregularities in company operations. The carefully worded statements stopped short of directly implicating Blackwood himself, but the implication was clear: they were abandoning a sinking ship. Drake reviewed these developments with his team, noting the accelerating collapse of Blackwood's business empire. His stock is now down 67%, Garrett reported. Major lenders are calling in loans. Project partners are terminating contracts under moral hazard clauses. And Pamela? Drake asked. Charlotte consulted her tablet, still at Vivian's estate, but increasingly isolated. Several social engagements canceled. Charity board positions temporarily suspended. Her social media accounts have been deactivated. Drake nodded, unsurprised. Chicago's elite were notoriously quick to distance themselves from scandal, regardless of long-standing relationships. Pamela, who had built her identity around social status and connections, would be feeling that rejection acutely. What's our next move? Lyle asked. Before Drake could answer, Stanley Goldman called with urgent news. Blackwood's attorney just contacted me, he reported. They're proposing a settlement meeting. Blackwood, his legal team, you and me. No prosecutors, no formal record. Drake considered this development. They're desperate. Absolutely, Stanley confirmed. The SEC investigation is expanding daily. Criminal charges mounting. Civil liabilities accumulating. They're looking for any exit strategy. What do you recommend? Stanley hesitated. Professionally, I'd advise hearing them out. Any potential resolution that limits ongoing legal costs and business disruption is worth considering. And personally, Stanley's voice hardened. I'd make them sweat. They try to destroy you, Drake. They don't deserve an easy out. Drake thought about it carefully. Schedule the meeting, Stanley. But make it clear, this is exploratory only. No commitments, no guarantees. After ending the call, Drake turned to his team. Blackwood's looking for a lifeline. I need to understand what he's offering before deciding our next steps. Be careful, Charlotte warned. This could be another trap. That's why we'll be exceptionally well prepared, Drake assured her. And why we'll have contingency plans for every possible scenario. That evening, Drake received 2 more significant updates. First, Miriam reported that their contact in Mexico had approached Thornhill with a carefully crafted story about representing investors interested in information about Blackwood's operations. Thornhill had cautiously expressed interest in a meeting. Second, Zoe called again, her voice tight with controlled anger. Mom just tried something unbelievable, she said without preamble. She called Ben directly, told him she could help his career if he would help moderate the divorce situation with you. Drake's hand tightened on the phone. She tried to manipulate your husband? Essentially offered professional connections in exchange for him pressuring you, Zoe confirmed. Ben was furious, told her never to contact him directly again. I'm sorry you're both dealing with this, Drake said sincerely. I'm starting to understand what you've been dealing with, Zoe replied quietly. The extent of her calculation. The conversation reinforced Drake's certainty that maintaining his course was the right decision. Pamela and Blackwood had shown no genuine remorse. only frustration at being exposed and anxiety about consequences. The settlement meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon in a neutral location, a conference room at Stanley's law firm. Drake arrived early, reviewing strategy with his attorney, while Garrett prepared financial documentation that might be relevant. Maxwell Blackwood entered with 3 attorneys flanking him like bodyguards. The developer looked significantly worse than during his courthouse appearance. Drawn, sleep-deprived, his customary confidence replaced by barely contained anxiety. Drake, he nodded stiffly. Maxwell, Drake replied with deliberate formality. After preliminary legal discussions establishing the confidential nature of the meeting, Blackwood's lead attorney outlined their proposal. Blackwood would provide testimony implicating Pamela as the primary architect of the conspiracy in exchange for Drake's support in reducing the financial and criminal charges Blackwood faced. My client acknowledges certain irregularities in business practices, the attorney stated carefully, but he maintains that the more serious allegations regarding the planned false evidence against Callaway Construction were driven primarily by Pamela Callaway's personal vendetta against her husband. Drake listened impassively, noting how quickly Blackwood was willing to sacrifice Pamela to save himself. Additionally, the attorney continued, my client is prepared to facilitate the return of all misappropriated materials and compensate for any verifiable losses resulting from contract interference. Stanley responded with professional skepticism, asking pointed questions about specific evidence and timeline verification. Drake remained silent, studying Blackwood's increasingly desperate expression. Finally, when the attorneys had exhausted their technical discussion, Drake addressed Blackwood directly. You conspired with my wife to destroy me professionally after helping destroy my marriage personally, he stated flatly. You planned to use my daughter's wedding as a platform for public humiliation. You manipulated employees, fabricated evidence, and committed multiple financial crimes along the way. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. Business is complicated, Drake. Lines get blurred. This wasn't business, Drake countered coldly. This was calculated personal destruction. Look, Blackwood leaned forward, dropping the pretense of legal formality. We both know how this goes. Long, expensive legal battles. Reputational damage on all sides. Nobody truly wins. One side is already winning, Drake observed. Your company is collapsing. Your freedom is in jeopardy. Your reputation is irreparably damaged. And yet I'm offering you a way to expedite resolution, Blackwood pressed. Pamela was the driving force here, Drake. She approached me initially. She orchestrated the wedding humiliation plan. She suggested using her mother's judicial connections. Drake regarded him steadily. Throwing her under the bus won't save you, Max. I'm just stating facts, Blackwood insisted, desperation edging into his voice. Work with me on this, Drake. We can contain the damage. Preserve what's salvageable. Drake stood, buttoning his jacket in a signal that the meeting was concluding. Stanley will review your proposal and respond formally through proper channels. That's all I can offer today. As they left the conference room, Stanley murmured, they're running scared. We have significant leverage. Yes, Drake agreed. And now we know how quickly they'll turn on each other. That night, Drake received another text from Blackwood's phone. You're making a mistake, Drake. I still have information that could hurt you. Last chance for mutual cooperation. Drake forwarded the message to Stanley with a simple instruction. Document the continued intimidation attempts. No response from our side. As he prepared for bed, Drake reflected on the day's developments. Blackwood was crumbling, willing to sacrifice Pamela to save himself. Pamela was desperately trying to leverage her daughter's marriage for protection. Vivian's influence was diminishing as the scandal expanded. The revenge Drake had orchestrated was working exactly as planned. Methodical, comprehensive, inescapable. Not through violence or illegal actions, but through the systematic exposure of truth and the natural consequences that followed. Justice, not vengeance. A distinction he maintained even as the destruction of his enemies accelerated. Chapter 9. Foundations. 1 month after Zoe's wedding, Drake stood on the partially completed top floor of his newest project, a 30-story mixed-use building on Chicago's west side. The structure was still skeletal, offering unobstructed views of the city in all directions. The autumn wind cut through his heavy coat, but Drake welcomed the physical discomfort as a counterpoint to the day's events. 6 hours earlier, he had sat in the back of a federal courtroom and watched Maxwell Blackwood plead guilty to 17 felony counts in exchange for a reduced sentence. The plea deal, 10 years in federal prison, forfeiture of significant assets, and permanent disbarment from certain business activities, represented a complete capitulation by the once prominent developer. Drake had maintained his composure throughout the proceedings, even when Blackwood briefly glanced back at him, a flash of hatred in his defeated eyes. The victory felt appropriate but hollow, justice served, but at the cost of so much collateral damage. Lyle joined him at the edge of the unfinished floor, handing him a steaming thermos cap of coffee. "Hell of a day," the older man commented. Drake nodded, sipping the bitter coffee. "One down. Thornhill next," Lyle confirmed. "Our people in Mexico confirmed he's agreed to meet the investors tomorrow. By this time next week, he'll be in custody and singing like a canary." Drake gazed at the Chicago skyline, the familiar architecture grounding him amid the chaos of recent weeks. "And Pamela's divorce countersuit? Dismissed this morning," Lyle reported with satisfaction. Judge threw it out after reviewing the complete evidence package. Called her claims frivolous and contradicted by substantial documentation. Stanley says she's running out of legal options. Good. Drake turned away from the edge, moving toward the temporary construction elevator. What about the Richardson Block project? City's reopened bidding. We're favored now that Blackwood's out of the picture. Planning Commission meets next Tuesday. As they descended to street level, Drake contemplated the next phase of his life. The revenge had consumed him for months, planning, executing, managing the aftermath. Now, with Blackwood convicted and Pamela's legal maneuvers failing, he faced the prospect of rebuilding not just his business, but his personal life. "Zoe's back from Michigan," Drake mentioned as they reached his car. "We're having dinner tonight." Lyle nodded approvingly. "Good. Family's what matters in the end." "What's left of it?" Drake replied, a rare hint of melancholy breaking through his composed exterior. That evening, Drake met Zoe at a small Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park, the same place where he had first warned her about the wedding complications months earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of them as they settled into a quiet corner booth. "You look better," Zoe observed, studying her father's face. "Less haunted." Drake managed a small smile. "Closure helps. Blackwood's conviction, the company stabilizing. I saw the news about his plea deal." Zoe sipped her water. 10 years seems light considering what he tried to do. "The financial penalties are substantial," Drake explained. "His company dismantled, assets seized. The prison time is just one component." They ordered, falling into comfortable conversation about Zoe's work at the hospital and Ben's adjustment to their married life. It was only after their entrees arrived that Zoe broached the more difficult subject. "I met with Mom yesterday," she said carefully, watching her father's reaction. Drake's expression remained neutral. "How is she?" "Struggling. Grandma Vivian's social influence has basically evaporated. Most of their friends have distanced themselves." Zoe pushed pasta around her plate. "Mom's been dropped from 3 charity boards, and the country club is reviewing her membership status. The social consequences were inevitable," Drake observed without satisfaction. "She wanted me to ask if you'd consider a more generous settlement," Zoe continued. "Said she's facing financial hardship now that access to the joint accounts is permanently restricted." Drake set down his fork. "Zoe, I hope you told her." "I did," she interrupted firmly. "I told her I'm not getting involved in the divorce negotiations, that she needs to work through her attorney." Zoe met his gaze directly. "I'm not taking sides, Dad, but I'm also not becoming her messenger." Pride swelled in Drake's chest at his daughter's maturity. "Thank you. And for what it's worth, I'm not seeking to impoverish her. The settlement offer is fair, considerably more than most would offer given the circumstances." They finished dinner discussing more pleasant topics. Zoe's plans to specialize in pediatric surgery, the Michigan property she and Ben had fallen in love with, Drake's latest building designs. As they parted outside the restaurant, Zoe hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered. "Not for what you did at the wedding, that's still complicated for me, but for how you've handled everything since." With dignity. Her words stayed with Drake as he returned to his temporary apartment, a balm to the lingering wounds of betrayal and public scandal. The next morning brought news from Miriam's team in Mexico. Vincent Thornhill had taken the bait, meeting with the supposed investors and providing detailed information about Blackwood's operations in exchange for promised financial backing for a new venture. What Thornhill didn't realize was that the entire conversation had been recorded, his admissions of materials theft, contract interference, and conspiracy meticulously documented. More importantly, the investors had convinced him to travel to Texas for a meeting with their principals, placing him back on U.S. soil where arrest warrants waited. "He'll be in custody by tomorrow evening," Miriam reported via encrypted call. And based on the preliminary conversations, he's eager to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Drake absorbed this information with grim satisfaction. "Send me the complete recordings once he's in custody." And Miriam? "Excellent work. Just doing my job," she replied modestly. "Though I will say, this has been one of my more satisfying cases. They really did try to destroy you, Drake." "Tried and failed," he agreed. "Now they pay the price." By week's end, the news broke publicly. Vincent Thornhill arrested at Dallas International Airport, immediately providing damning testimony against both Maxwell Blackwood and Pamela Calloway in exchange for reduced charges. The final piece of Drake's counter-strategy slid into place, completing the legal encirclement of those who had conspired against him. 2 days later, Drake received an unexpected visitor at his office, Judge William Porter. "Judge," Drake greeted him with surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." Porter nodded formally, taking the offered seat across from Drake's desk. "This isn't an official visit, Calloway. More of a personal update. Regarding my son and your daughter, primarily." Porter's judicial demeanor softened slightly. "They've been through an extraordinary ordeal because of circumstances neither created. I wanted to personally ensure that our family conflict doesn't affect their relationship with either parent." Drake appreciated the sentiment. "Zoe and I have maintained open communication throughout. I've been careful not to place her in the middle, as have I with Benjamin," Porter assured him. "Which brings me to my second purpose." He hesitated. "Vivian Keller has been formally censured by the Judicial Ethics Committee. Her attempts to influence case assignments crossed serious lines." Drake raised an eyebrow. "I'm surprised you're sharing this with me." "It will be public information by tomorrow," Porter explained. "I thought you should hear it directly, given your history with the family." The news represented another domino falling in the aftermath of Drake's counterattack. Vivian's precious social standing further diminished by professional censure. "Thank you for the information," Drake said simply. Porter stood to leave, then paused. "One final matter. The Richardson Block project. I understand you're now the presumptive developer." Drake nodded cautiously. "The Planning Commission meets next week for final approval. My court occasionally uses that neighborhood for outreach programs," Porter mentioned casually. "The area could benefit from community spaces within the new development. Something to consider in your final designs." With that subtle suggestion of future cooperation, Porter departed, leaving Drake to contemplate the shifting alliances in his post-revenge landscape. Enemies neutralized, new potential allies emerging, opportunities expanding where doors had previously been closed. That evening, as Drake reviewed updated designs for the Richardson project, Stanley Goldman called with significant news. Pamela's attorney reached out, the lawyer reported. "They want to settle. Immediately. No more delays. No more counterfilings." Drake set down his pen. "What changed?" "Thornhill's testimony hit her hard," Stanley explained. "And apparently some financial reality is setting in. Vivian's resources are more limited than anticipated, especially with the ethics censure affecting her standing." "What are they proposing?" "Acceptance of your original terms, with minor modifications regarding personal property division." Stanley sounded pleased. "It's a complete capitulation, Drake." more favorable than what we would likely get even with a sympathetic judge. Drake considered the offer, recognizing it as the effective end of his 25-year marriage. Not with the dramatic courtroom confrontation Pamela had initially threatened, but with a quiet legal surrender. Accept it, he decided. Let's end this chapter. 3 days later, Drake signed the final divorce papers in Stanley's office, officially terminating his marriage to Pamela Calloway. The process was anticlimactic. No dramatic confrontation, no final exchange of accusations. Just signatures on legal documents, efficiently executed and promptly filed. As Drake left the law office, he felt a strange lightness. Not happiness exactly, but the unburdening that comes with true closure. 25 years of shared history, concluded in black and white. The betrayal addressed, the conspiracy dismantled, justice served through legal means rather than personal vengeance. He walked through Millennium Park, watching families enjoy the early winter sunshine. For the first time in months, his thoughts turned fully toward the future rather than the painful recent past. New projects awaited. His company was stronger than ever, having weathered the conspiracy attempt and emerged with enhanced reputation for integrity. His relationship with Zoe was healing, strengthening through honest communication. Drake's phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. Planning Commission unanimously approved Richardson Block project. Press conference tomorrow at 10 a.m. Another piece falling into place. Drake smiled slightly, typing his acknowledgement before continuing his walk. Chicago spread around him. The city he had helped build, the landscape of his professional triumphs and personal trials. After months of focused revenge, he found himself considering new possibilities, new horizons. That night, alone in his temporary apartment, Drake poured a rare, celebratory scotch and stepped onto the balcony. The city lights twinkled below, a canvas of potential. His revenge complete, his enemies neutralized, his reputation and business intact despite their best efforts to destroy both. He raised his glass to the skyline. To foundations, he murmured. And to what comes next? Epilogue. 1 year later. The grand opening of Calloway Tower at Richardson Block drew Chicago's business and civic leaders, media, and curious citizens. The striking 40-story structure combined Drake's signature restoration of historical elements with bold modern additions, respecting the past while embracing the future. Drake stood at the podium, surveying the assembled crowd. This building represents more than steel, concrete, and glass, he stated, his voice carrying across the plaza. It represents resilience, adaptation, the ability to weather storms and emerge stronger. In the front row, Zoe and Ben applauded warmly. Their relationship with Drake had deepened over the past year, Sunday dinners becoming a regular tradition. Behind them, Judge Porter nodded approvingly. His suggested community spaces prominently featured in the building's lower levels, already scheduled for judicial outreach programs. Charlotte stood nearby, now promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Calloway Construction after her unwavering loyalty during the crisis. Lyle, semi-retired but still involved as a special advisor, beamed with pride at his friend's triumphant moment. As Drake concluded his remarks and the ceremonial ribbon was cut, he allowed himself to reflect on the journey of the past 18 months. Maxwell Blackwood remained in federal prison, his business empire dismantled, his reputation destroyed. Vincent Thornhill had received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony, but would still serve 5 years for his role in the conspiracy. Vivian Keller had retreated to Florida after her social standing in Chicago collapsed. Her influence evaporated. And Pamela? Last Drake had heard, she was living modestly in Milwaukee, attempting to rebuild some semblance of a life far from the Chicago society that had once defined her existence. She maintained limited, strained contact with Zoe, but had never apologized or acknowledged her actions. The revenge Drake had orchestrated had been complete, but disciplined, focused on justice rather than cruelty, on consequences rather than suffering. He had maintained his integrity throughout, never stooping to their level despite ample opportunity and justification. After the ceremony, as guests toured the new building, Drake found a quiet moment with Zoe on the observation deck overlooking the city. "It's magnificent, Dad," she said, slipping her arm through his. "Your best work yet." Drake smiled, squeezing her hand affectionately. "Just the beginning. We're breaking ground on a lakefront project next month." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city spread before them like a living map of possibilities. "Are you happy, Dad?" Zoe asked suddenly. "After everything that happened, everything you lost." Drake considered the question thoughtfully. The betrayal had left scars, certainly. 25 years couldn't be erased or forgotten. But the past year had brought unexpected gifts, a closer relationship with his daughter, new professional opportunities, freedom from a marriage that had become toxic long before he recognized it. "I'm at peace," he answered honestly. "And building something new, that's enough." As the sun began to set over Chicago, casting golden light across the skyline he had helped shape, Drake Calloway stood at the summit of his newest creation. Not just a building, but a life reconstructed after betrayal, stronger and more authentic than before. The name tag that once said housekeeper had become a distant memory, replaced by the legacy of a man who had faced destruction with dignity and emerged victorious not through cruelty, but through truth. Not through vengeance, but through justice. A man who had lost a wife, but saved his soul. A man who had been betrayed, but refused to become what he despised. A man who had rebuilt himself alongside his buildings, with careful planning, solid foundations, and an eye toward what could be rather than what had been. Drake Calloway, architect, father, survivor, master of his own destiny once more. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.